My awareness of a lot of the podcasting, the kind of the podcasting exploits of people on YouTube really came to prominence during the pandemic. Everyone was content heavy, and I think a lot of people were looking towards Netflix thing, documentaries and stuff like that, entertainment wise. I looked for, and I'm sure, in fact, I know a lot of specifically young men were, because most of my friends were all doing the same thing. We were looking for kind of communities, and we were looking for, more information based things to kind of keep abreast of the world and keep a pulse of how things were progressing so that we can remain contemporary. It's kind of natural to want to do that. In your eyes, then, since the pandemic and since kind of the explosion of a lot of people, I mean, it just seems to me, and you're an expert in this, I'm just a layman. It seems like everyone has a fucking podcast these days. Yeah. Even fuckers who do podcasts for other people have their own fucking podcast talking about other people's podcasts. It seems like there's a saturation, but there also seems to be an appetite and a hunger like there kind of hasn't ever been before. But do the numbers suggest that, or does your own experience suggest that, considering everything that you've experienced with, again, because your bread and butter for a long time was producing audio content. Like you say, having gone on a fact-finding mission, found out that the scope of the market in America is so much wider and more fertile than it is in the UK, or at least the potential the UK had at the time. Like, how do you see the landscape of things at the moment? Do you see it as being what I perceive it to be, which is kind of oversaturated, or do you see it as still kind of, it's still finding its feet a little bit? Because it seems to me it's still like the fact that it's called a podcast. It's not on the iPlayer, and it's not on not the iPlayer. It's not broadcast by Apple Tunes. By definition, the word podcast is oxymoronic. It doesn't make sense, but it's the term people use. Tells me that people still have a fundamental misunderstanding of the medium itself and what it has to offer.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you said that, because I always get frowned at when I say that at any sort of industry event. Podcast is a redundant phrase. There are an awful lot of people who say an awful lot of things about podcasts that I'm not sure I completely agree with. I don't think anyone's reinvented the wheel. It's just audio on demand. That's all. It's
100%.
The nature of it means that we can do different things. So I always use Critical Role, the Dungeons and Dragons podcast and YouTube video, as a case in point. No mainstream TV network or radio station would ever devote 4 hours to a Dungeons and Dragons show. That would be deemed insane. But because you can do things on YouTube, as you yourself do, because you can do things on podcasts, as Critical Role do, you can lock down a very, very narrow audience. And when you go back through the history of radio is mostly, you try and spread your aim to cover as many possible people as you can, offending as few as you possibly can, whereas podcasts are much more narrow. You can, and the other thing I used to say was, you have to tell people, what's your ambition? What's your aim? I used to sit down with corporate clients and say, what do you want out of this? Because there are 3 different reasons, realistically, for making a podcast. One's to make money, and that's perfectly reasonable. 2's to build profile, and that's perfectly reasonable. And 3 is to have fun, which is arguably the best reason of them all. So we go back to the point about saturation. It depends how you phrase the question. Is the market saturated with people having fun? No, definitely not. Look around the world, loads of people not having fun. More fun can be had. There's no limit to the fun. In boosting a profile, is there saturation? Possibly. Making a podcast, putting a celebrity on it, not necessarily the magic bullet it was before. In terms of making money, there it gets very, very interesting. Because if you were to look at the podcasting industry as like a cityscape, you would have a couple of skyscrapers, and then it would be mostly shantytown.
Sure.
I can't remember the exact stat someone told me, which is really embarrassing, but it was something like, if you get more than 500 listeners, you're in the top 10% of all podcasts. If you get more than 10,000 listeners, you're in like the top 0.5. Because...
I beg your pardon? What?
Not because podcasts are not popular, but because there are so many podcasts listed on Apple Pods that are very, very, very small scale, that bring the average right down.
Right,
if you've
okay.
got 10,000 podcasts that are getting 20 listeners and one that's getting 100,000, when you do the average there, that's going to be a very surprising number.
Right.
So if you are making a podcast and you want to monetize it, you really have 2 major routes. One is advertising, which is very, very difficult when the economy is going backwards. And two is essentially self-funding through like a Patreon scheme or something like that, which can be a really, really good way of doing things. But also when the economy starts to contract, people look for things that they can stop spending money on. So it gets more and more challenging. This is one of the many good reasons for Muddy Knees Media being with The Athletic now, is that the commercial imperative is, should be careful if my bosses are listening to this, we obviously still want to make money, but it's not live or die now. With Muddy Knees Media, if we'd lost a big advertising deal, it would have had a very deleterious effect on the company. We're owned by the New York Times, who own The Athletic, who have all of these podcasts. So we're not as imperiled by the commercial issues as we would have been before. And there you drop into the raising the profile. The great thing about athletic podcasts is they serve as a kind of a touch point. If you've never read The Athletic, you might just have heard about it. You might have listened to one of the podcasts with Mark Chapman, now 4 times a week. And you might have sort of come in from there and gone, oh my God, I did not know George Corkin worked for The Athletic. Bang, I'll subscribe. So no, it's not saturation, but it is saturation for specific mission objectives, like making money when you're a small company.